you have these two starkly different options: kiss up to them, appease them, support them, or war with them. That war is on. We're at war with them, or rather they are at war with us. And they've been at war with us since 1979, the revolution, and they've been killing us ever since, and they're killing us today, and that continues. So it's a false option. It's typical of the wrong-headed thinking that goes on about Iran.
I'm Ben Weingarten, and this is Big Ideas with Ben Weingarten, a podcast where we talk with exceptional thinkers and doers about the most important ideas and issues of our time and all time. In this week's episode, my guest is Micheal Ledeen. Micheal is a historian, longtime think tanker, currently serving as the Freedom Scholar at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, former special advisor to the Secretary of State and consultant to the National Security Council during the Reagan administration, a position justly earned as a Cold Warrior who was deemed an enemy of the Soviet Union, a badge he wears with honor, and an author of 38 books. Most pertinent to our conversation, Ledeen is an expert on Iran with deep ties to dissidents and countless individuals in the diaspora cultivated over many decades, dating back to the fall of the Shah and the revolution of 1979. As an expert in what is really going on the ground in Iran, and in a time in which, following America's exit from Iran deal, the nation's currency is collapsing, billions of dollars are flowing out of the country's coffers, it faces ecological disasters, and all amid widespread protests, seemingly over not just the nation's basket case economy or its backing of jihadist movements abroad, exporting its revolution while its people suffer, but the theocratic and totalitarian government and regime itself. I thought that there would be no better time to have Ledeen on to discuss the state of that nation and American policy and interests relative to it. During our conversation, Ledeen and I touched on a variety of topics, including his view on how long the current Khomeinist regime will survive, what America might do to help topple it, the phony Sunni-Shia jihadist split, often bandied about in the national security and foreign policy establishment, the nature of Iran's dissidents, what happens the day after the regime falls to its sprawling criminal jihadist network led by Hezbollah and the IRGC, and more. Ledeen and I also discussed the targeting of those who challenge the national security and foreign policy establishment, including regarding both Iran and Israel, and the related sackings of Larry Franklin and General Michael Flynn, the latter of whom, with which, Micheal co-authored a book, The Field of Fight. Ledeen shares his take on General Flynn's guilty plea, which he believes was given falsely, and explains why he believes General Flynn was targeted in the first place. You won't want to miss this explanation. If you like the conversation you're about to hear and you find it valuable, I hope you'll consider subscribing to, rating, and reviewing the podcast in the iTunes store or wherever else you're listening to us. And if you want to find out more about the show, you can visit our website at benweingarten.com/bigideas and follow me on Twitter at BHWeingarten. And now, without further ado, my conversation with Micheal Ledeen. So, Micheal, what got you interested in Iran in the first place?
It was something that happened to me. I was editing the Washington Quarterly. The Shah fell, and it was obvious that we had to do some big story in the Washington Quarterly called Carter and the Fall of the Shah. So I rummaged around Washington, and I came up with a terrific guy named Bill Lewis, who had just retired from state and knew a lot about Iran, and I said to him, write an article called Carter and the Fall of the Shah. And he said, how long? And I said, as long as you want the whole magazine. We'll give you the whole magazine, just do it. And he came back in a few months and said, okay, I've got all this stuff, and here's this other stuff that I haven't been able to find out. And I looked at it, and it seemed to me like things that I could probably find out. Some had to do with French intelligence, some had to do with the Israeli government, and so on. And I had just come back from Rome. And so I said to him, well, suppose I try to track down the stuff, and if it works out, we'll do it together. He said, fine. we did an article called Carter and the Fall of the Shah. And it was a big hit, and Knopf offered us a book contract, and we took that, we did a book. So that's how I became interested in Iran. It happened to me, and while doing it, the book, I met more and more Iranians, and over the years I've met a seemingly endless array of Iranians, and I just kept up with it. There was no way to escape it. I mean, not a day goes by where I don't get a call from some part of the Iranian diaspora, or it's some person claiming to be in Iran, and so I do it. I've been doing it.
What is the real history of CIA involvement in Iranian regimes?
Oh, CIA, the main history of CIA and Iran is the CIA has always been wrong. They've never once gotten it right, so far as I know. I mean, every prediction they've made has been wrong. And they've been wrong on people, and they've been wrong on sources, and all of that. They're not very good.
There are those who argue, especially in the last administration, they put out a strawman argument where the alternatives in Iran are either war or give billions of dollars to a regime, appease them, protect their nuclear infrastructure, etc. And there is a question that you have to ask before you even get to what is the right policy, which is, what is it that fundamentally drives the mullahocracy? Is it materialism? Is it expanding the Islamic Revolution? So spiritual, material, or is it their own self-interest ultimately that drives them?
Well, the first thing to say is that you have these two starkly different options: kiss up to them, appease them, support them, or war with them. Is that war is on. We're at war with them, or rather they are at war with us. And they've been at war with us since 1979, the revolution. And they've been killing us ever since, and they're killing us today, and that continues. So it's a false option. It's typical of the wrong-headed thinking that goes on about Iran.
And those who are critical of your writing cast you as, a neocon, warmonger, etc. What would you say to those people if you could speak directly to them about that view?
I don't know what a neocon is, and I don't know what neoconservatism is. If you ask me if I believe in revolution and support it in Iran, the answer is yes. I believe in it. It happens sometimes. Rarely it succeeds. And we as a nation are the only revolutionary country in the world, and we should support democratic revolution in places like Iran.
And you've supported, among other things, and this is sort of a parallel to during the Cold War, information warfare. That is propaganda in the best sense of the term, being pushed into Iran as a means of challenging the regime in the ideological space, because ultimately ideological warfare is paramount. What would your comprehensive policy be for fomenting a revolution and taking this regime down?
Well, let's do the Cold War, because what happened is that the Reagan administration sent out people like me to go talk to anti-Soviet dissidents in the Soviet Union and in places like Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, etc. And we did. I talked to the Lech Wałęsa people in Poland, and I talked to the Havel people in Czechoslovakia. And as we talked, I would say to them, what do you need? We would love to see you people succeed in overthrowing the Soviet Empire. What can we do to help? And they told us they made suggestions, some of which had not occurred to us. Fax machines. Fax machine was a revolutionary instrument. Well, no, we didn't think of it that way. But it was, because it enabled them to communicate with one another and transmit information and so on. I have no doubt that if we sat down and talked to Iranian dissidents today and said, okay, we would love to see you succeed, what do you need, what can we do, they would similarly propose things to us that we have not figured out. One of the great discoveries in the years of the end of the Cold War, the 80s and early 90s, was that what they lacked, they had all kinds of information about the outside world. What they did not know was what was going on all over their own country. So people in Moscow did not know what was happening in what we now call Petersburg, Leningrad, and ditto all over the place. It's the same with the Iranians. Iranians in Tabriz do not know what's going on in Tehran. Iranians in Tehran are not aware that the revolution's going on also in Mashhad and demonstrations and so on and so forth. They need to know that. I think that's what Pompeo was talking about in his speech a couple of days ago at the Reagan Library. I'm not sure because he didn't quite spell it out. But he seemed to be talking about something like that. We were going to increase our broadcasting to them and talk to them, which is important.
How perilous is the situation for the regime today? There are a few indicators. Obviously, as you mentioned, there are protests going on throughout the country, including in Tehran. There's massive inflation. Usually the way that the currency goes gives you an indication for the direction that the government is going.
Well, there's no water.
There's no water?
Above all, there's no water, and it's hot.
So given that, how close is the regime, in your view, to toppling, or what would the signs be that it really is buckling and in serious trouble?
Oh, the regime can fall any minute, literally. It would not surprise me if it fell the next day or two, as it would not surprise me if it went out for several months. Timing is very hard to forecast. So, but it's in its last gasp.
So what does that look like? When this regime, it will not fall without a fight. It will clearly be very bloody, and you've already seen it be bloody in terms of how the secret police have dealt with protesters and also, of course, shutting down communications and the like in the country. What does it look like, and what is the aftermath of the regime's collapse?
Well, they all look different, so who knows? But I agree with you. I think it will be quite bloody. They've killed an awful lot of people. This so-called moderate Rouhani regime has increased the execution rate inside Iran by 50%, which is spectacular. And people have a lot of vengeance to wreak on this regime and an awful lot of revenge to take, and they will.
What happens to the Hezbollah infrastructure that exists, including in our southern hemisphere? And of course, I'm sure there are cells in the U.S. today. What happens to that apparatus when the regime itself falls?
Well, one of the corollaries of the regime falling in Tehran is that Hezbollah will also fall in Syria. And the whole world changes. It's quite amazing when you think of the consequences of the fall of the Islamic Republic of Iran. The whole world.
How big or how intense is the genuinely secular liberal resistance in Iran? Obviously, you see the pictures of what Iran was like under the Shah, where you had middle-class Westerners, largely secular, largely liberal, but we're now 40 years on from that. So how big is that genuine resistance that is actually pro-Western today?
I don't know how to measure it, but it's plenty big, and mosques are empty. So radical Shiism, which inspired the '79 revolution and the makeup of this regime, is pretty much a dead letter. It's not popular. It's a young population. Young populations are typically secular, not religious. And so I think for the moment, there was a story yesterday, was it, or the day before, which caught my attention, which was about a Zoroastrian who was elected to, I think, a town council or something like that, and he'd been blocked because you can't have Zoroastrians running the country. And then the regime relented and backed off, and he joined the council. And I gave it a wow on my Twitter feed. Things like that strike me as very significant. And if there were freedom in Iran today, you would see the biggest Zoroastrian revival in history. So it's not exactly secular, but it's certainly not radical Islam.
Of the opposition, maybe the one that gets the most billing in Western media is a group that was designated as a terrorist organization up until a few years ago, that being MEK. What are we supposed to make of MEK, and are they a reliable ally?
The main thing about MEK is that it matters very little inside Iran. They have a very small following. And that's easy to understand because they killed Iranians. They were agents of Saddam. And so they're very unpopular in Iran overall. And what we should worry about is the 70-plus million Iranians who are opposed to this regime and are in the streets, and not a few thousand followers of Mrs. Rajavi, who's not a Democrat, not particularly pro-American, and is not going to be the leader of the coming Iranian revolution, although they do produce useful intelligence every now and then.
One of the enduring myths that I've seen when it comes to Iran and more broadly the sort of Sunni-Shia split that is spoken of is the idea that among the jihadist groups, they don't actually coordinate when it's very clear based upon the historical record that they do. I wonder if you'd speak a little bit to the coordination of activities between supposed enemies that hate each other and will fight to the death, which of course they do.
Well, who are we talking about? I mean, give me an example.
So one example would be Iran harboring al-Qaeda agents pre-9/11. And obviously backing Hamas as well, Hamas being a Sunni group.
Well, and ever since, Iran has the son of Osama bin Laden. And al-Qaeda's been in Iran all along and operating out of Iran all along. We know this now. I think even CIA knows this. And the Iranian government has announced it. Al-Qaeda has announced it. I mean, there's public documents. So the Sunni-Shia thing is grossly overrated. It's like mafia. Normally, if you go to see The Godfather, you find that mafia families are fighting each other all the time for territory and business and so forth. But when the feds appear on the scene and come after them, 5 families sit down around the table and make a war plan. So it's the same with the Sunni and the Shia. They've sat down around their table and they've made a war plan. And they cooperate.
Iran and Russia historically have not gotten along particularly well. Should we be doing things, we being the U.S. government, to foment strife between them and split them off from each other?
Well, it's worth a try, and Trump is trying that. It's false to say that Iran and Russia haven't gotten along. They haven't. Russia's been involved in Iranian affairs, or to use our common language, Russia's been meddling in Iran all along, hundreds of years, as we have, by the way. And that's traditional, that's normal, so nothing new there. Does Putin want to make a deal over Iran? Can he control Iran? I don't know. Who knows? What we do know is that the Russians are in Syria or following an Iranian request. The Iranians were losing in Syria. They went to Putin and said, help, we're losing, do something, help us. And Putin said, charmed, love to. And so he is, so he's in. Is he willing to leave? Does he want to stay forever? How does he feel about alliance with a radical Shiite revolutionary country like Iran? I don't know. I mean, he must have at least some second thoughts about a nuclear Iran. The whole Iranian nuclear program is Russian. It's all Russian. It's Russian technology. It's Russian scientists. It's Russian military experts. Bushehr, which is their main reactor, that's all Russian, built by the Russians, operated by Russians, and so on. So they have a lot to say.
If you are just a civilian and you want to get up to speed on the actual truth of what is going on the ground in Iran, what are the publications or who are the people that you would follow?
I would follow...
Besides yourself, obviously.
Well, FTD, Foundation for Defense of Democracy, is a good organizing center because they talk to all the top scientists and report on those developments. So that's the easiest, quickest place.
Now, at your wife's request, who is a bold patriot, she asked that I ask you about the Larry Franklin story. So I wonder if you'd speak a bit to that.
Well, what can I say? Larry Franklin's another victim of the intelligence community, hatred of Israel and Jews and people who support Israel and all of that. Larry Franklin did a lot of work on Iran back in the day, 80s, and was unhappy with our government's policy toward Iran, thought we should be more aggressive and so forth, and thought Israel should be too. And he went to AIPAC and talked to a couple of guys at AIPAC about going after the mullahs, going after Iran and so forth. And the FBI became aware of these conversations and started recording them. And then after a while, they charged Franklin and the AIPAC people with things, which came to Larry's having to do community service for some number of years. A lot of false stories written about him, claiming that he'd been indicted or convicted or something of espionage, which never happened. He was never charged with it. He was charged with taking home classified documents to work on them because he had a sick wife, and if he stayed in the Pentagon, he would get home very late and couldn't properly take care of his wife. So Larry Franklin is one of those many people who's been targeted by mostly FBI, who should get presidential pardons. And if I were in charge of pardons, he'd be one of the first persons.
Since you sort of alluded to it indirectly, General Flynn, you wrote a book with General Flynn. I've written articles, so for our listeners, supportive of the fact that it very much appears to have been that General Flynn was effectively ambushed in his office and taken out of office on the shoddiest of possible grounds. And if you read the charging statement, it's very clear that the grounds were based upon legitimate conversations that he had, and supposedly FBI agents who said they didn't feel there was any wrongdoing in his statements. You are close to General Flynn. You've witnessed the entire saga as the country has witnessed it. What do you make of everything that's happened? What do you feel about it? And do you think he will ultimately be vindicated?
Well, I've written it. Obviously, he cannot discuss it with me, so I don't know anything more than anybody else does. But it seems to me pretty obvious that he did not lie to investigators. That so-called conversation is always misreported. He was routinely talking to FBI people about setting up the National Security Council and about how the relationship would work and all of that. So these FBI guys, including Strzok, were in and out of his office all the time, constantly. And during one of these meetings, they asked him questions about his conversations with the Russian ambassador. He did not have any reason to think that this was any different from any other past conversation. And so he didn't ask for an attorney to come in and say, don't you dare answer those questions. And so he said things to them which later on has somehow enabled them to claim that he lied or he made false statements or something in their conversations after having told the director of FBI that they did not think he was lying or had lied. I believe that General Flynn has falsely pleaded guilty, and he pleaded guilty in order to turn off the pain machine for his wife, his children, his family in general, and so on. It's a terrible thing to live through. No one who hasn't actually been through it can imagine what it's like. But start by thinking about every morning when you get up and walk out your front door, there's screaming journalists asking you, well, are you guilty? Are you a Russian spy? Are you this? Are you that? And so on. And that follows you all day long until you get back in the house and close the door and all of that. And ditto for other members of your family and so forth. And it's really very unpleasant. And I can well imagine the Flynn family reaching a point where General Flynn would go to the attorney and say, look, this is all nonsense. I can't get out of this no matter what I do. What do I have to do to turn it off? I've got to turn it off. Because otherwise my wife's going to go crazy. My kids are going to go crazy and so on. And the attorney will have said, well, you can plead guilty. So he pleaded guilty. I've seen that a lot. That's happened a lot over the years. And I've written about it in connection with Iran-Contra, where I was the target of a special prosecutor and lived through the same sort of thing that General Flynn has been living through. He is, however, a national hero. He's one of the great men in the history of American intelligence, and he's part of a very important story about our intelligence community and how politicized they've become and how badly they've been doing their job.
And that's the deeper question at the end of the day. Why was he perceived as such a threat that he had to go through this ordeal and be effectively taken out?
He was a threat. He changed intelligence. He reformed the way we do intelligence on the battlefield, and that cut out an awful lot of people with stars on their shoulders back in the Pentagon in Washington. And he was starting to do the same thing at DIA, and they did not like that. They didn't want that, and they went after him. And first they got rid of him at DIA, and then they were terrified when he became so close to Trump. And when he was named pending National Security Advisor and then became National Security Advisor, they went all out after him.
Micheal, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please do help us out by subscribing to, rating, and reviewing Big Ideas with Ben Weingarten in the iTunes Store or wherever else you're listening to us. I'm your host, Ben Weingarten. You can find out more about the podcast at benweingarten.com/bigideas or at BHWeingarten on Twitter. Thanks so much for listening, and we hope you'll join us next time.